it drives clients crazy. You know, that it took you, this much, and I'm paying for the number of hours it took, and you're paying for input instead of output, right? You're paying for hours instead of results, and output. And that's where we get into the whole thing around value-based pricing, right? Paying for task activities and deliverables and results, and not how many hours it take you to do it, because it could take one attorney 5 hours to do something, another attorney 10 hours to do the same thing.
What lessons does a former law firm CMO have to share about the business of law? How is the law firm business model going to evolve in the AI era? And how can you get better rates and outcomes from the firms that you work with? Today, we are joined on the abstract by Ken Callander, managing principal at Value Strategies, where he works with corporate legal departments to help them get more value and predictability from their outside counsel relationships. He's got a bunch of lessons about negotiating rates that he's going to be sharing today. Ken has been in the legal space for more than a decade, including as head of legal operations and chief of staff at Uber, and, as I referenced, as the chief marketing officer at Davis, Wright, and Tremaine, which is a big, notable law firm based out of the Seattle area, if I remember correctly. Ken spent the first couple of decades of his career not in legal as a marketer, but at large companies like Agilent and HP. Ken, thanks so much for joining me today for this episode of The Abstract.
Yeah, Tyler, great to be here.
Well, you're a pretty candid guy, I think. And so I'm not going to start with a light topic. No like softball right off the bat. We're going to be talking a lot about law firms today. Obviously, law firms, big law, has been in the news recently, as many of the largest firms. There's a few who aren't. There are a few who are fighting this, but a lot of them are cutting deals with the Trump administration, offering pro bono work that they say they would be offering otherwise, or they'd be doing otherwise, in exchange for the administration not targeting them with executive orders around access to security clearances, government contracts. I mean, what do you think about this? But also in the context of the conversation we're going to be having today, how is this in some ways derivative of the law firm business model, that they would feel a need to cut these sorts of deals?
Yeah. It's totally a derivative of the law firm business model, right? This is a huge topic in the legal circles right now. Obviously, everyone is talking about this. And, obviously from the side, and it was interesting, I was just in a meeting last week, a long meeting in person with a whole group of lawyers. And, in sort of the downtime, this was the topic that people talked about.
Sure.
And the interesting thing that they said is, and I said, well, how many of you have signed on to this petition, and they all said, oh, we totally agree that, this was the wrong thing to do, but I'm not signing the petition.
Right.
And it sort of is a gateway into just how, people think about this, right? In the sense that they're totally against, being coerced and pressured by the administration. But on this other hand, none of them want to fall prey to, and the big thing that came up was, security clearances, that really only covers certain types of work. Government contracts is a much bigger deal, right? Because so much work flows through the government one way or the other. But what each of these attorneys, and they're all litigators, brought up was, hey, I can't be kept out of a federal courthouse, right?
Right.
Being access to federal buildings, he says it would destroy my practice, and so I'm not signing on to anything because I don't want to be targeted and, being kept out of a federal courthouse. Because that would end my practice. So it's the fear piece of it, I think, more than anything. From a law firm business model, obviously just about every firm out there does litigation. Being kept out of a federal courthouse would stop their practice, right? They wouldn't be able to operate. And I think, and obviously government contracts, and also, if you've got clients that are government clients or related to the government, that could hinder your ability to work for your clients. And so
Hmm.
I think a lot of the big firms, so I see both sides of this.
Hmm.
From a business standpoint, the firms say, we wouldn't be able to operate, and we would lose clients and wouldn't be able to operate. We wouldn't be able to go into federal buildings, including courthouses, and we would basically cease to operate. And the other side of it says, hey, these firms that you're talking about that they've targeted have, PPPs, which is, profits per equity partner,
Hmm.
in the range of $6 to $8 million per partner range, right?
Right.
And, really, you guys haven't made enough money so far that you could, that, you to stand up for what you believe in, right?
Hmm.
Um, so I understand it. I understand where law firms coming from. Law firms are businesses, right? And they need
Hmm.
to operate. But on the other hand, you know, a lot of people look at that and say, you guys make so much money as it is, really, and that's where your focus is to continue to make that kind of money.
Hmm.
And you see these revolts by associates, and the branding. And I think there was just an article this morning about what is this going to do to the branding and being able to recruit new talent for these firms, where
Yeah.
they're saying, I'm not going to go, I'll go to another. There's a lot of, top firms like that out there. I'm just going to go to a different firm,
Hmm.
or I'm going to leave you and, as a top associate and go to one of these firms that didn't cave.
Right.
The firms, the Wilmer and Perkins and Jenner and the ones like that are fighting this, they're getting a lot of props out of that, right?
Sure.
And I think you're going to see a lot of top talent say, "Hey, I want to work with you guys," right? So, it, like I said, I see both sides of it. I understand why they're doing it,
Hmm.
but it's it could cause them brand issues and other things down the road that we'll see, right? People's minds, memories get pretty short, and in
Yeah.
1 year, people will probably forget about it. But that's just, so I understand, and I understand where people are coming from on
I
both
feel
sides.
like there's a calculus that they're making as well, which is that, to your point, the memories of GCs or other folks who are making decisions about who they work with, even if they don't like what's happening right now, when push comes to shove, maybe they still go to Latham for their IPO or their big debt
Yeah,
raise,
you're
or
totally right.
right.
And a lot of GCs have spoken out and said, "Well, wish you shouldn't have." I mean, Paul Graywall just the other day, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, as you well know, he came out and said, You guys didn't ask me about this before you started doing that, right?" So uh, they've come out and said, I'm not going to work with you guys anymore. But like
Hmm.
you said, memories are short, and if you get to a point where you want to use K&E, right, because
Yep.
they are one of the top M&A firms out there, and you're going to do a deal, it's like, okay, they're still the best or one of the best, and we've used them in the past, and we want to use them again. So, you know, uh, when it comes to business, it's like, okay, who's the best that we want, or who we've used before that knows us and understands us and could do it again. And, so it may just blow over, over time. And I think that's what they're kind of counting on.
Yeah. Um, that's unfortunate, but
Yeah.
it makes sense in the context of the business of law firms, which is one of the things that we're going to be talking about
Yep.
today. Okay, so you spent a bit of time both doing BD work, leading marketing, almost operating as sort of a COO at Davis Wright and Tremaine. I mean, that must have been a really great education in how law firms work from the inside, and getting to see all aspects of it. What was it that led you there, and away from sort of the more traditional corporate marketing that you'd been doing for a lot of your career?
Yeah. At HP especially at HP, I was doing, I started off in operations and manufacturing and ended up, in the professional services area.
Hmm.
I was doing marketing and business development and pricing of professional services. And then I went over to Agilent. We split the company with HP and Agilent. I went over to Agilent in corporate marketing, helping run and their corporate marketing organization. And but that professional services piece, when I left Agilent, I started doing consulting around professional services because that's what I
Hmm.
knew,
Uh-huh.
seen in business development and the like. And I did work for some accounting firms and architectural firms and stuff. And I started to do work for some law firms. I'm not a lawyer, I'm a business guy, but law is, legal services are professional services, right? And so, um, and it was interesting because when I started trying to talk with firms, they said, "Oh, well, legal's different, right?" And and I try to say, it really isn't. It's still professional services, whether you're talking about consulting services or engineering services or accounting services or architectural services. You're doing the same thing. You're selling, the services of a professional, right?
Hmm.
And legal services is the same thing. And of course, lawyers think they're different. And so it took a little while to convince them. But I started to do some work for some firms, some law firms, and that's when Davis Wright asked me to come in and build out their business development team, and that's how I started full time at Davis Wright. So it was an interesting change because I've always worked in the corporate space.
Hmm.
It's a very hierarchical structure. You've got the board and the CEO, and then it falls down. Whereas a law firm is a partnership. And
Right.
that's um, the thing at Davis Wright or at any big firm is, I had 300 owners
Yeah.
that you're dealing with, right? Uh, and that is a challenge, right? Because
Yeah.
you're not reporting, and every firm is a little bit different. Some firms truly are hierarchical, where you've got a managing partner or a chairman that leads the firm, and they lead it with sort of an iron fist, and
Hmm.
uh, and what they say goes. But then you have other firms where it's truly a partnership,
Hmm.
and that, and even in the more hierarchical firms, you've got what I call power partners, right? And these are partners with large books of business, and they sort of have veto power over
Right.
anything that the firm wants to do, or the strong say in it, because firms are afraid that they're going to, if they're not happy, they're going to leave and go to somewhere else and take all their clients with them, right? And
Yeah.
that hits revenue and it hits the confidence that, firms are built on confidence, right? They don't own anything.
Hmm.
They lease their space, they lease everything, they lease equipment. It's not like a regular corporation where, if you liquidate, you've got assets, all sorts of assets and equipment and real
Right.
estate and everything else. Law firms don't have anything except really, their AR, right?
Hmm.
And um, they would say, well, our contact list, yeah, okay, but those are all belong to individual partners, right? Uh,
Yeah.
Partners keep contacts in a lot of cases to themselves. They're not really the firm's clients, they're the partners' clients or the attorney's clients. So, um, and that's why when you've seen in the past some of these firms that blow up, like Heller or Howery or Thielen or
Hmm.
Lehman, whoever, it's like there's nothing left, to go after except maybe the AR, right?
Yeah.
And that's sort of what, but so the firms know that, and they're deathly afraid of power partners, or any large numbers of partners leaving because,
Hmm.
everyone starts to panic and say something's wrong here. What's going on? Maybe I should be looking, and so they do everything they can, which is why we get into the whole thing around pricing and, what I do in value-based pricing and the like, because, moving to fixed fee type arrangements, based on value,
Hmm.
doesn't mesh well with most of the firm's comp models that are based on hourly billings, right? And
Hmm.
origination. And um, and because of that, you end up with sort of a conflict there between how you're pricing something and how you're compensating, the people that are providing those services. And so that, causes an issue. But for them to change their comp models, because law firms are basically a zero-based dollar business where,
Hmm.
at the end of the year, you zero basically everything out and you pay out the total revenues to, after all your expenses and salaries and everything else, the partners share the equity of the firm and they get paid, the profits of that. That zeroes out at the end of the year. And so if you change a comp model, because it says, it's a zero-based structure, some attorneys are going to get paid more and some are going to get paid less in a new model.
Right.
And the ones that get paid less aren't going to be happy and they're going to leave, and take their clients with them. And nobody, and so it's sort of the third rail of law firm politics. You just don't touch compensation,
Yeah.
because it's such a fraught area. And so it's really interesting, and again, is the partnership model. And again, the fact that, they're based on confidence. I
Hmm.
sometimes say they're sort of like a house of cards, right?
Hmm.
And you pull out one card and the whole thing can become unstable, right? And so they really worry about that. And so you going back to our first topic, you start,
Yes.
you know, hampering people being able to do their work because they can't go to courthouses, or they can't, they lose contracts with clients because they have government work, whatever, and people will start leaving, right? And then the whole thing falls apart, so, last one out, turn off the lights.
Yeah, it's not lost on, I think, myself and others who were reading about like the Paul Weiss negotiations, which were covered in much more depth because they were the first one. And of course, their top corporate partner, who they pay 20 plus $1 million a year to, has huge book of business around M&A. And right, I mean, he's personally involved in all the negotiations because they're looking at that and they're like, if this guy leaves, that's a material hole in
Right.
like annual revenue and what profits per
Right.
partner looks like
Your
across the
revenue
firm.
drops like that, right?
Yeah.
People go, oh, geez, well, I'm going to get paid less because, that's,
Yeah.
that revenue goes to me. And geez, who else is going to leave, right? And then, maybe I should be looking. And it's become a snowball effect.
Yeah.
And that's what I mean. It's all based on the confidence of the firm that they are a solid firm, right? And if that starts to erode, people start bailing. And once, that starts to snowball, it's a hard thing to stop.
Are there okay? We'll talk about sort of value based pricing in a minute, and I think that it's a great topic for all the in house folks who are listening to learn more about and think more about. Are there good things about this sort of partnership model or this comp model? I mean, I suppose it evolved over time, but it also probably didn't evolve entirely in a vacuum. Like, do you have thoughts on whether or not there are good things about this approach, or does it just really need to be blown up and
Well, it's obviously done well, right? The
yeah.
way that it is. And so, in the sense that, it operates well, and, um, and it served its clients well, and
Yeah.
people get good value, and they feel, I mean, they're paying it, there aren't a lot of other options, but still. But if you look at other professional services industries out
Mhm.
there, so take accounting, or take, um, consultancy, right? Corporate consultancy, like, the Bains or the McKinsey type uh, organizations, or your like I said, your big four
Uh-huh.
accountancy firms. They sort of got off hourly rates decades ago. Okay,
Mhm.
when you go to McKinsey, and you say, "Hey, we're going to do an M&A integration. We just bought this, buying this company. I want to integrate them in. We want you to help us do this whole integration." They come in and say, well, it's $8.5 million.
Right.
you know, uh, I had a long conversation with the head of that used to be the president of KPMG, and
Hmm.
he's the one that sort of took them in the '90s off of hourly rates and over to a salaried model. Right? He said it took about 3 to 4 years. It was a very painful experience
Mhm.
because you had the same thing where people, didn't get paid the same way, and some made more or some made less, and people left. Um, but he realized that this is where they had to go. They had to move to a salary model. And what they did is, for their consultancy group, for example, is they had US healthcare, group, that
Hmm.
would work. And they moved to each of those people got a salary based on experience and everything else. And then the group as a whole, based on the profitability of that group, was
Hmm.
paid a bonus at the end of the year based on how they did against their profitability targets, right?
Interesting.
Uh, and the interesting thing about that, which is very different than law firms, is that in law firms, there's the whole eat what you kill sort of, uh, program that they go with, whereas and so the partners and lawyers in a law firm tend to be, you know, soloists that all sort of have their own practices and they're under uh, one sort of roof, of an organization, as their for their overhead and everything else that
Yeah.
manages it. But they still tend to, be individual lawyers, and they all, and a lot of firms, it's tough to get lawyers to share their contacts, and they want, when they bring in a new client, they want to be the relationship partner, even if it's not
Sure.
in the space, that they're good with, because it's their contact, and they get very protective of their contacts, and that's because again, that structure that you've got where you get your compensation is based on these formulas that include billing hours, and the
Hmm.
like. So um, when KPMG moved to this model, all of a sudden now this group of, for example, like I said, the healthcare group,
Yeah.
they realize that they will make more money individually with their bonuses if the whole team works together and gets as much work as possible done as fast as possible and good quality and everything else, and they'll back each other up because they all know, and they also will call people out that aren't pulling their own weight, and
Right.
everything else. Very different than a law firm, right? Because
Hmm.
law firms tend to be a lot more siloed, right? And they'll, even though firms work with what they call client teams,
Hmm.
where they try and bring, all the different partners that are working for a particular client in different practice areas together to talk about how do we basically work together. There's still this sort of tension about, well, this is my practice area and
Hmm.
my work and my clients and my relationships and the people I work with. Whereas if you move to that salaried model, you change that dynamic where everyone actually does want to work together because the end goal is the same for everybody, where everyone's going to get compensated based on the group. Whereas
Right.
in the law firm model, the comp is a different structure, right? So you get origination credit and everything else that goes into it, and it's
Hmm.
not based on the profitability of that client as a whole, right? It's
Hmm.
your matter that you're doing is going to base your compensation, not how the client does as a whole. So it changes that and makes everybody work together, much more like an in-house team, right? An
Right.
in-house team works, they all get paid. And I had this conversation where, well, that's how people get paid by hour. Lawyers get paid by hourly. It's always been that way. And I said, you realize that half the attorneys out there work on a salary basis. They're
Yeah.
all right? They don't get paid by the hour, and they all work much more collaboratively in house because they all have a goal in mind. For their corporation to do well. They
Hmm.
tend to back each other up much more. They're working together, and they get paid a salary, and they don't get tracked in most cases by how many hours they spend, um, and and they don't, if they have to get a deal done over the weekend, they work over the weekend and they're still get paid the same, right? So
Yep.
um, it's a completely different model, and it changes the dynamics of how people work together, right? So uh, obviously, so I think that's why the big four and the big consulting companies, management consulting companies, moved off of hourly rates
Hmm.
because they saw the benefit, I think, of that. to get the law firms, so a lot of the newer firms that are starting up are in this model. They realize this is the better
Mm-hmm.
model. But to take an old shoe law firm with the old model and convert it is very fraught with it not being successful, right?
Right.
Because you'd have to go through that process where people say this doesn't work for me, and there's so many other firms that still use that old model. There, are they just going to go? Well, I'm just going to go across the street
Mm-hmm.
because they're going to pay me, on this model. And the other thing about firms, and when I tell this to younger partners, they always agree with me. That is, law firms are run by the senior partners in the
Sure.
firm. And the senior partners have no incentive to change anything while they're there.
Right.
Because it worked for them. That's how they are getting, got to where they are, and how they're doing well under the model that they've got.
Mm-hmm.
And they all will sell you, and I ran into this with a lot of firms. They'll just say, hey, when I'm gone, you can do whatever you want, but while I'm here, this is how we're doing it, right? And it's frustrating, I think, to a lot of the junior partners. It's like, we need to make changes, but the
Mm-hmm.
senior partners run the firm, and they're the ones that are going to make those decisions, right? So, when I'm gone, you can do what you want, and that's sort of what I hear, a lot of them say. And it's like, hey, I'm not changing it. It's, because it works for me. And that's, again,
Mm-hmm.
partnership model creates that sort of dynamic.
So you develop this understanding of how law firms work. Work for Davis Wright and Tremaine for a number of years. But then you decide to go, we'll call it in-house, right? And go to Uber and lead legal ops there. Tell us a little bit about why you wanted to make that shift. And also, I'm curious about, how do you apply this knowledge then, or apply this understanding of how firms work to help Uber and their legal team run better?
Yeah. I was about, 7 years, I think, at Davis Wright. And law firms, I loved it. Great people. Um, really enjoyed people I worked with there and all. But, some of the other dynamics I mentioned, like the fact that you have, 280, 300, owners you're dealing with, uh, all different personalities. Well, you get that anywhere. You get different
Hmm.
personalities. Um, but because you're not a quote unquote owner or a partner, even though you're a C-level executive, you're still considered staff, right?
Right.
So it's and I decided I wanted to go back to the corporate world, because again, that ownership structure is difficult to
Hmm.
manage, um, and so going back to the corporate world where you have that more of that hierarchical structure works better, I think, at least for me. And so going in house at Uber, in the legal department as head of legal operations, having, especially when dealing with outside counsel, knowing how law firms think,
Hmm.
how they work, and how law firm economics works was hugely advantageous for me when dealing with negotiating with law firms, because sort of where the hot buttons are, right?
Yeah.
Where, and how to manage that. I don't want to use the word manipulative, but it's you do get to understand how they think, right?
Hmm.
What's important to them. So um and and it's not just all compensation. Lawyers, in-house lawyers, really care about their clients, right? And they want their
Hmm.
clients to be successful, right? So it's not like it's just all about the money. That's not true, right?
Yep.
They really do care about their clients. um, but there are hindrances that get in the way, in terms of making that work, because the hourly rate doesn't incentivize firms to be efficient, right?
Hmm.
And a lot of people would argue that it incentivizes firms to be inefficient,
Hmm.
you know? So, and you can't really argue with that, right? Even though people will try to argue with that, it doesn't incentivize efficiency.
Right.
And clients, it drives clients crazy, you know? that it took you, this much, and I'm paying for the number of hours it took, and you're
Hmm.
paying for input instead of output, right? You're paying for
Right.
hours instead of results, and output. And that's where we get into the whole thing around value-based pricing, right? Paying for tasks, activities, and deliverables and results, and not how many hours does it take you to do it, because it could take one
Hmm.
attorney 5 hours to do something, and another attorney 10 hours to do the same thing.
So how did you go about both sort of implementing more of a value-based pricing approach when you were at Uber, and then how do you do this today for clients? Because I would imagine also convincing in-house teams to shift the way that they think about their relationships with firms is not always an easy part of the puzzle to make fit. I'm sure sometimes it's very simple, and the attorney, right, says, "I absolutely want to do this, and this makes sense." And I'm sure sometimes, you might have someone raise their hand and say, "Yeah, okay, maybe we're wasting 20% on this firm, but having that partner pick up the phone at 9 o'clock on a Saturday night is really important to me. So." Is that really what we care about? I'm curious how you go about doing this, both practically at Uber and today with clients. Yeah.
Yeah, the way it started was, about 6 months in at Uber, I went to our general counsel and I just said, we're spending way too much on outside counsel. And this was back, when I started at Uber, I think we had 14 lawyers, right? Now they have hundreds of lawyers,
Wow.
right? But, and we were litigation coming out of our ears, right?
Sure.
And so basically the in-house team really didn't have the ability or the time to really do legal work. They were just managing outside counsel, for
Yeah.
right. Um, and so I just said to our general counsel, I said, we're spending way too much on outside counsel. If you really want to be innovative and creative, let's think about getting off hourly rates onto value-based fee arrangements, right? And she
Hmm.
said, okay, what's that? And I said, well, we were using it at HP back in the 1990s for professional services. And I tried to get the law firm to go there,
Yeah.
in some cases, but we just couldn't move the needle. And that's a whole nother story. Um, but, uh, but being on the buy side here, um, I think we might be able to, make some traction. So she said, okay, let's try it. And we started with corporate, an M&A sort of space. And over the next year and a half, we moved almost everything off of hourly rates across Uber. Okay, saving us
Wow.
millions of dollars. Um, Again, because you and the savings come from the fact that you're forcing the firms to become more efficient, right?
Hmm.
Because you're paying for that value and not the hours anymore, and so you gain that efficiency. What I find with most of my clients, all my clients, the savings are between 20 and 50% in outside.
Really?
Yeah,
That high?
yeah, oh yeah.
Huh.
So because and that's that efficiency gain, and there's some other pieces to it too, but um, and you just think about it, again, firms don't have that incentive, and when you change that incentive, and the whole thing is around value-based pricing is trying to align the incentives between the client and the firm, right?
Hmm.
Um, so but yeah, so that at Uber, we started to do that. This was back in, you know 2013, 2014,
Hmm.
when value-based pricing hadn't really been seen by a lot of these firms, and because Uber was using some of the biggest firms out there, this was uh, a little bit of a shock to them,
Yeah.
that we're pushing this. Now, 10 years later, uh, all the big firms have seen this, and this is, and we'll get into this discussion when we talk about AI.
Yeah.
This is where I think it's going to sort of go anyway. So
Uh-huh.
we won't ever get completely rid of the billable hour, I don't think, but I think a lot of it is going to change over.
Does this work for I guess the question, or the way I'd put it to you is there a minimum sort of threshold of spend where, like beneath this it doesn't work? Because we've got listeners probably who are at companies that spend tens if not hundreds of millions on outside counsel every year. We've also got folks who have an outside counsel budget of 650K, right, for the year, and are working as a solo GC. Or so how do you counsel folks, or how should you think about value-based pricing? Like are the gains really for the sort of like top end companies, or could this work across a whole spectrum, startups and up?
So the answer is it can work across everything and every
Yeah.
practice area, right? So you can do it, across the board. Yes, if you're spending hundreds of millions, uh, having a savings of even 20 or 30% is a
Right.
really big number, right? And so that, obviously can drive a lot more of it than if you're spending, a half a million a year. The effort to make this happen, is it really worth the savings?
Mm-hmm.
um, that's up to you to decide, right? I still have, some very small clients that just they the big piece of it besides the savings is the predictability,
Right.
right? And so there's a lot of value in that predictability. So I think for the smaller clients, you know, that are on tight budgets and are being held to a budget, the difference today versus 10 years ago was, you know, a lot of general counsels and CLOs, 10 years ago, they kind of got a pass when it came to their budgets, right? I
Mm-hmm.
mean, they were given a budget, but they could always say, "Oh, well, we had this big deal, or we had this big litigation matter, or we had this big thing come up, so we've gone over budget,"
Yeah.
and the CFO would kind of give them a pass. In a lot of companies nowadays, they're like every other manager in the company. They've got a budget, they've got to stick to it.
Yeah.
And and when I was at HP, it's like, this is your budget, and if you can't manage it, we can find somebody else who can, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Uh, and so there's a lot more pressure, I think, now on most GCs and CLOs to maintain their budget. So predictability, and I have clients that'll pay more to have a predictable budget than uh,
Uh,
than they might have paid on an hourly basis, because now they know that what they're going to be paying, and they don't have to worry about having an open PO that could go way over the mark.
that's interesting.
Yeah, so there's value in that. So for the smaller clients, it may not always be about the savings as much as it's going to be about that predictability,
Mm-hmm.
and the savings, the soft savings you're going to get in terms of administrative costs.
Mm-hmm. Let's let's talk a little bit about the AI piece. Uh, I think well, one question is, it doesn't seem like many, although maybe smaller firms, uh, are making these sorts of shifts proactively. But people seem to think that the rise of AI, the ability to use AI for legal research, initial drafts, et cetera, I mean, this is going to deeply sort of affect the pyramid model of, you've got a lot of associates and the associates bill a lot of hours, right? So I guess, a question is the pressure still going to come from the client side? For how long is the pressure going to come from the client side? Or is AI going to really force a rethinking of the way that law firms operate and their business models, and then how they price their services
Right.
ultimately? Right.
You know, Obviously this, and I get asked this question a lot, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, this is obviously the big topic these days. Um, it's interesting if you think about law firms and the way they work. Um, let's take litigation, and you're doing a motion to dismiss, right?
Okay.
So currently, or in the past, the model has been, okay, we're going to put 4 or 5 associates on this to do the research, look at case law, look at, previous similar cases that
Mm-hmm.
we've had, and the like. They're going to put together an initial draft. It's going to, they could spend tens or hundreds of hours, doing this. We get a first draft of this motion to dismiss. It goes to the partner who then reviews it. It goes to another partner, goes back and forth, and finally goes to the client to
Mm-hmm.
review and revise, et cetera, et cetera. Then it gets filed with the court. You do the hearing, et cetera, et cetera. So now, and we're not quite there yet, but we will be there. I think where you're going to have an AI, a closed AI system that's got, and most of the court records are public, right, in terms of filings and everything else that goes in there. Uh, every complaint, every motion to dismiss for every matter out there, in every jurisdiction against with every plaintiff attorney and every judge, that knows and the outcomes, and how
Mm-hmm.
they, all of that's in there where you could just say, here's the complaint we have in this jurisdiction with this judge and even against this plaintiff attorney. What is the best argument we can make, for this motion to dismiss? Give us a first draft.
Right.
And it can, almost instantly give you that first draft. Okay. In the past, you charged a client maybe tens or hundreds of hours of associate time to
Mm-hmm.
get that research and your first draft done. Now you've got it done in minutes, right?
Right.
Uh, what are you going to charge for that, right?
Yeah.
um, what is the law firm going to charge for that? Now, there's been some ABA ethics ruling around the fact that you can't charge, you know, more than the hours it took you to do that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, I saw something, I think it was out of Texas, that ABA that was talking about this, and so this is a big topic. So, the idea then is, well, that's going to really hit our revenue numbers because we used to get X number of dollars for this type of research.
Mm-hmm.
Now we can't charge for this, and of course it's still going to go to the partner to review, et cetera, et cetera. So that piece is the same, but that whole research piece up front, um, the idea then is the firms have to start thinking about, well, what's the value of this research to the client, right?
Right.
And to charge for that initial draft for the value that we're delivering to them, right? And then we all of a sudden now are moving away from hours because that's how we got. But if those hours, if you're getting super more efficient
Mm-hmm.
as you're using AI, that efficiency is going to dig into your hours model and
Yep.
you're not going to be able to bill as many hours. So your revenue is going to go down considerably because AI is forcing you to be more efficient. So in order to maintain your same level of revenue,
Mm-hmm.
that you were having in the past, you're going to have to come up with a different model to 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 charge for that, right?
Right.
And you're going to have to say, well, the value of this is a very difficult case, when we've got our professionals and we have this initial draft, but we're have to modify it, et cetera, et cetera. So the value is X, and we're going to charge you X for this motion to dismiss.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think that AI, and that's just an example in that, think also about advice and counsel, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have, and I like to use the example because I know of a law firm that's doing this, building out basically a chatbot for employment advice and counsel in all 50 states.
Interesting.
Um, right now, if you're a large employer and you've got employees in any or all of the 50 states, you have to go to an Oklahoma employment attorney to ask for Oklahoma employment question because employment law is mostly state specific, right?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Now, if you have a chatbot that you can go to ask those questions that knows all those laws in all 50 states
Mm-hmm.
and is backed up by attorneys, but to make sure that because there's always nuances and everything to it, but as those nuances get built into the training, as you go through it, it'll get better and better, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, what would you charge for that, right? For
Right.
that, there is one large firm out there that's figured out that this is a problem for them. And before some third party builds out this, chatbot for
Mm-hmm.
advice and counsel, they're going to build it out and back it up with their employment attorneys, right?
Right.
So, but then be able to sell that as a service, right? that
Mm-hmm.
capital, right? Just like they could sell their attorneys. But if you think about all of this, where does that leave associates, right?
Right.
Because if you have a lot of this work, you know, think about doc review, think about contract review,
Mm-hmm.
all the stuff that, that's how they learn how to be lawyers.
Yes.
They don't learn in law school. That's just book work, right? Textbook work. Um, how to be lawyers. And uh, if you don't need as many associates, because a lot of that work can be done with AI, where do the future partners come from?
Yep.
It's a real, you know, uh, question that's going through the legal community right now,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a big one, and um, and I don't know the answer to that. Now,
Mm-hmm.
I did sit in a panel several months ago where it had lawyers, both in-house team and law firm lawyers in there, and there was a lawyer there from a big firm, and he said, "Oh, that's not what's going to happen. What's going to happen is we're just going to get more efficient, and we can do 10 times more work for clients than we currently do because AI is going to help us do that, and we'll still bill by the hour and do." And my question back to him was, "So you're telling me that 90% of the work that comes in you turn down because you don't have the bandwidth to do it?"
Or I mean, yeah, or to like maybe the client can't afford to send the work to the firm potentially.
Yeah. But the
Yeah.
thing is that means that you've got to get 10 times more work coming in
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
do than you currently are doing. And I don't know really hardly any firms that turn down work that isn't
Yeah.
conflicted out, right? They'll
Yeah.
do everything that comes to them. So, this gets back to the musical chairs model where, there's only a certain amount of work out there, and at some point, you're
Mhm.
not going to have a chair to sit down when the music stops. So, you've got to, if all the firms are going to take on 10 times more work than they currently have,
Mhm.
where's that work going to come from, right?
Mhm.
So that, that's the fallacy in that train of thought, is that we'll just be able to do 10 times more work, because
Yeah.
then you have to take it from somebody else, that's doing it, right? Because there isn't it's a finite amount of work out there, right?
Mhm.
So, and yes, you're right, at cheaper rates you might get more work, but those firms aren't going to be charging cheaper rates, right?
Right. In fact, the hourly rates for top partners may go up. I think
It
potential.
could, yeah.
Right.
But already, they're hitting $2,500 an hour,
Right.
some of your top firms, and I already have clients who just say, where does this get to be ridiculous?
Mhm.
At 5,000 an hour or $10,000,
Yeah.
and you have, a 7, 8, 10% increase,
Yeah.
and you're already at $2,500 an hour. That's a big increase
Mhm.
versus, someone at $200 an hour with a 10% increase, right? It
Mhm.
becomes exponential,
Yeah.
and that curve, that exponential curve, there's a point at which, you know, and the other thing that law firms don't understand is the higher their rates get, and this isn't true for all practice areas, but the higher their rates get, the easier it is for the in-house teams to do business case models that can bring the work in-house.
Sure.
Um, if you can say for a 250 300,000 fully loaded FTE
Yep.
attorney in-house, we can pull in X number of dollars, 800 $900,000 with outside counsel work. You can, and the higher those rates go, the easier it is to make that business case, right?
Yes.
So they sort of are putting themselves out of work by doing that. Now, there are certain practice areas where you can't do that, right?
Mhm.
In-house, certain litigation,
Sure.
you need specialists in certain areas, but you don't need them all the time.
Yep.
There are other practice areas where that is very true, right?
Mhm.
So attorneys have to think about that.
Maybe a last sort of substantive question for you before we get to a few closing ones that I like to ask all my guests. Um, Given this landscape, I guess, and think about your clients, right? how do you advise in-house teams to evolve their outside counsel relationships to sort of take advantage of this moment or the moment that is coming? Like, what are the things that in-house counsel should be doing to make sure that they're sort of leading and on the vanguard and pushing their firms to do better work, better outcomes, lower cost, right? Like, what should folks be
Yeah.
doing?
So one thing, so going back to AI a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
I recommend my clients for each new matter to ask the firm, how are you going to use AI in this matter?
Mm-hmm.
If at all, if you're going to use it, how are you going to use it? And how is it going to benefit me? Right. And how is it going, you know, to affect the price that I'm paying for this work?
Uh-huh.
Um, that's a new thing we've started now recommending we ask the firms because otherwise you don't know if they're using AI or not, right?
Mm-hmm.
Unless you ask, right? So, and in many cases they may be, right? And so, and you want to know that. I think
Yep.
even outside of the pricing and everything else, I think you'd want to know, are you using AI for this or not? Okay. And we're starting to put that in outside counsel guidelines too, as well.
Mm-hmm.
So that's number one. I also think it's important to really have better communication with your firms. And so for your top firms, I always recommend that you at least do an annual review with your firms where you have the firms come in and you talk about all the matters for the year, what went well, what didn't go well, what could we do better,
Mm-hmm.
what could you do better, and it's a two-sided conversation, right? It's not just, you know, the client asking the firm, but also the firm asking the client, hey, here's how you could do better for us, how we could work better together.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, we send you stuff, it goes into this black hole. We don't hear anything from, a week. We don't know what's going on, that sort of thing. I think that really helps relationships and it really helps both sides to understand each other better and work better together, right?
Mm-hmm.
In like a partnership arrangement between the two. Um, in some cases on big matters, I think it's useful at the end of a big matter to have that conversation. Hey,
Right.
what went well, right? Like take a big transaction. Hey, we'd like to maybe use you again, but here's the things that we had a problem with, right? Or,
Mm-hmm.
and again, a two-sided conversation, right? Those are things I think when you talk about quality and, working together, and firms are typically happy to do that, but clients don't often ask for it, right?
Interesting.
And everybody's busy and doesn't have time to think about it, right? So, uh, but purposely doing that, either on an annual basis with your big firms or after big matters close up, to have those conversations, I think is really useful. When it comes to, reducing spend for in-house teams working with lawyers, uh, one of the first things that's pretty simple, and even without even getting to value-based fee arrangements, to think about is to have a matter intake process whereby you really think about aligning the
Mm-hmm.
value of the matter, both in economic and risk value and brand value, to the value price point of the firm.
Hmm.
Okay. In other words, have a process whereby lower value matters go are funneled through specifically to regional or super regional firms or smaller firms with lower hourly rate structures,
Mm-hmm.
instead of just giving everything to the most expensive firms.
Right.
By doing that, you save a lot of money. Okay. And just having an intake process that filters them through, and then your bigger, more expensive, strategic, high cost matters, they go to your big firms. Smaller
Mm-hmm.
ones go to the smaller firm. Just doing that, you'll save a huge amount of money. The other thing that is really helpful is, I was just talking to another client about this yesterday, or last week, um, is in-house having part of the review, the personal review process, the performance evaluation process of the in-house attorneys to have outside uh, spend management or legal spend management as one of the factors they get graded on.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of companies don't do that. And so the in-house attorneys, because they're not being measured on savings,
Mm-hmm.
don't don't think about it, don't care about it. We'll just go back to that big firm because you know they get good results, and that's great. But you can get also good results from a smaller firm, especially on lower cost matters. So having that as part of your performance eval process
Mm-hmm.
for the in-house team, um, and it doesn't have to be anything hard coded with 5% or 10% or anything like that. Just like, what are three things you did this year to reduce outside counsel spend?
Right.
Just having that in there will make them start to think about it, because if you don't measure it, people don't pay attention to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So and a lot of companies don't do that. I said the majority don't do that, and so the in-house team doesn't. And gets into the whole change management thing, right? Of how do you get the in-house team to do something different?
Mm-hmm.
Getting the law firms to do this differently is not a problem. Okay, it's because they want to please the clients, and the clients, what the client says is law, right? So, but getting the in-house team to do something different, uh, and that they've always done, is internal change management is the toughest thing I face.
Mm-hmm.
And just by and if they're not being measured on it, they're not going to think about it. So you measure it, all of a sudden people pay attention to it, right? So that's one thing, simple things you can do: align matter value to value price point of the firms, and putting that in the eval process for the in-house team can make a big difference.
Really great advice. Um, okay, I've got some closing questions for you that I like to ask all my guests that are a little fun, I think.
Okay,
the,
well,
fir-
I'll try.
the first one is if you have a favorite part of your day to day running the consultancy.
You know, what I love is I get to work with so many different companies,
Yeah.
and every company is different.
Mhm.
They all have different structures, different cultures, uh, what they do in house versus what they send outside. I've had, and they're different industries, everything from a very large university, to a high tech company, to an oil and gas company, to a power company. I mean, and they all are really in different spaces and have different legal issues. You
Yeah.
know, a healthcare company, uh, HIPAA and all the regulatory things they have to deal with, and the like, very different than a retail company that's is selling apparel, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the types of issues they deal with, and a university that deals with First Amendment issues, right?
Hmm.
you know, Pepper spraying protesters,
Yeah.
or they have police departments, that so they have police practices. I mean, things that normal corporations don't even think about. The tenure issues with professors and IP. And a
Hmm.
lot of clients have IP, but when you have researchers that do IP and they, and they have Nobel prizes and they want their patent, to be, prosecuted, um, even if you think it's not worth it, you got to do it anyway, because otherwise they'll leave and go to another university, right? So, I mean, these are all things that uh, make it really super interesting to work with all the different types of companies and different industries and all the different people. They're all just great people. So that day to day, that's what I love, is just the variety you get. Versus when you work in house, in any one company, you're just immersed in that industry and that technology into that
Yep.
organization. You don't see that. Um, where I get to work with all these different companies and different industries and different spaces and different cultures, so it makes it
Hmm.
really interesting.
Do you have a professional pet peeve?
Huh. Um, I talked a minute ago about change management and
Yeah.
getting in-house teams to do things differently. Probably the pet peeve, and I've had this ever since I've been in work, even back at HP, is, you know, the answer being, but that's how we always do it, right? It
Sure.
drives me nuts, right? Because that's, you're not thinking about doing something differently or being innovative. It's like, oh, but why do we do it that way? Well, that's how we always done it. That sort of answer, is probably drives me crazy. And because it's people get entrenched in the way they do things and they don't
Hmm.
want to change. And that's just human nature, the not wanting to change. But because the way we've always done it is not a good answer.
Yep.
So, and you don't get that out of most tech company employees
Hmm.
because they tend to be pushed to be more innovative. But your old school companies, which I do a lot of work with, you get that answer. It's like, really?
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's, that I just can't. And I've heard that for decades. It's not something new.
Do you have a book that you would like to recommend to the audience? And this does not have to be a legal book or a business book, but it certainly can be. It can just be something that you've read recently that you think would be fun for folks to read as well, too.
You know, there are so many books out there. I'll tell you the book when I started getting into pricing that sort of changed the way I thought about pricing. And it's a very wonky book. It's very technical. Because I knew you were going to ask. It's called the Strategy and Tactics of Pricing: A Guide to Profitable Decision Making by Thomas Nagel and Reed Holden. And it was written about 20 years ago,
Okay.
25 years ago. And when people ask me if they're getting into pricing, and that's pricing of products or services or anything, it's sort of like what I always thought was the Bible of pricing.
Hmm.
Um, and so if people get into pricing, I say, I would grab this book and read it. It's a slow read. Okay. It is very technical and detailed. It is not, a light novel for,
Uh-huh.
so, but from a technical standpoint and really understanding what is price, versus value and understanding all of that, it's super helpful.
And my last question for you, Ken, it's my traditional closing question for my guests. So if you could look back on sort of the earlier days in your career, and I'll let you kind of pick. Do you want to like start at the beginning of your career or when you started to work more at a law firm? Something that you know now that you wish that you'd known back then.
Oh, um, something I sort of learned over the decades was, you know, how, and this is kind of completely off topic, but in every organization, you have to deal with politics,
Sure.
right? And politics, people try to escape it. You can't escape it. Whether you're in a law firm or corporation or any larger, even a nonprofit, anything, there's always internal politics.
Hmm.
And I have, it took me years to figure out how to sort of navigate that. Uh, and I finally decided, at HP and even in the law firm, I had a little Swiss flag I put on my desk. And I always said, don't take sides in political discussions. Okay. People will try and get you to, go to their side on a particular political issue or internal issue. Now, if there's some things you have to take a side on, but
Hmm.
in a lot of things where there's sort of two factions out there, and one group wants to do this, and the other group wants to do that, and they try and get you to be on their side.
Hmm.
I would just tell them I don't take sides,
Yeah.
right? And by doing that, they'll be pissed off at you that you didn't take their side. But they're also not upset because you didn't take they're not upset that you took the other side because you didn't.
Hmm.
And you tend to you can end up being the mediator of the two sides. Um, and they respect you for the fact that you didn't take the other side, right?
Hmm.
And because once you take one side, the other side, they'll never forget that
Yeah.
you were against them on this, and that person can end up being your boss someday, right? So by not taking sides, and always take the high roads, rule number two, right?
Mm-hmm.
Rule number three is always maintain confidence. And somebody tells you something, don't ever repeat what people tell you.
Mm-hmm.
And once people realize that you don't take sides and that you take the high road and that you don't repeat anything that someone tells you,
Mm-hmm.
people will tell you everything.
Mm-hmm.
And they'll come to you and close your door in your office and tell you what's going on and vent, this way and that way.
Mm-hmm.
And it actually will give you an advantage because you'll know more about what's going on in the organization than anybody else.
Mm-hmm.
And people will come to you for advice, and how do I deal with this person? And, they're being a jerk and yada, 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 and you can sit there and the idea is, and I brought it up when we talked about that very first topic. I
Yeah.
said, I see both sides of this, right?
Sure.
I understand your side and I understand the other side, right? I understand where you're both coming from, and you both
Mm-hmm.
had good points and bad points, but I'm not going to take a side, right? And I found that in corporate politics and any sort of organizational politics, you will survive much better by those three rules than anything else. That's probably different than any answer you've gotten
I have
before.
not gotten that before, and I love that. That's great. Great advice, and great advice all the way through. This has been a super interesting conversation for me, Ken, and I hope our audience thinks so as well. I think, understanding how law firms and professional services are going to evolve when they're such a big part of training for a lot of folks, but moreover, the day to day that in-house counsel deal with. I think you got to understand the future and what's coming in order to adapt to it. So, thanks so much for joining me for this episode.
Well, thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun.
And to all of our listeners, thank you for tuning in, and we hope to see you next time.